September 15th, 1964. It was a Tuesday. Harlem was moving through its usual routine, but at 3:47 p.m. time stopped. Palm Café on 125th Street. A place where people didn't come just for coffee. Decisions were made here. At the corner table where he sat every day, Bumpy Johnson was seated, coffee in front of him, a cigar in his hand, and on his face that calm only carried by men who know exactly where they stand. Then the caf door opened. 2 white uniforms, 2 polished badges, and 2 hands, resting close to their pistols. Officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski. From the 28th Precinct. They didn't look around. They walked straight to Bumpy's table. Bumpy Johnson, their voice loud enough for everyone in the caf to hear. Illegal gambling. Narcotics. Assault on an officer. The words weren't read. They were thrown at him. Stand up. Hands behind your back. Now. But Bumpy Johnson didn't stand. He simply raised his eyes and asked one question. Whose paycheck came in this week, officer? Vincent Gigante's, or City Hall's? The caf became hard to breathe in. And then, a single word was spoken. A word that, in those days, wasn't just an insult. It was a command. In that moment, Harlem understood. This wasn't just an arrest. It was the beginning of a war. If you're new to this channel and hearing these untold stories for the first time, don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next lives less in official history and far more in Harlem's memory. They expected anger. That's why they kept their hands close to their guns. But Bumpy Johnson didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look surprised. He stood up slowly, not because he was told, but because he chose to. The chair didn't scrape the floor. Someone nearby had already moved it. Officer Kowalski reached for the handcuffs. For a brief second, his hands paused. That pause said everything. Inside the Palm Café, no one spoke. No cups clinked. No footsteps moved. The cuffs closed. Outside, the street already knew. By the time they stepped onto 125th Street, a crowd had formed. Store owners leaned against their doors. Cars slowed to a crawl. People stopped walking. They watched as Bumpy Johnson, clean suit, straight posture, calm eyes, was escorted down the sidewalk in full view of Harlem. This wasn't procedure. This was display. Bumpy didn't resist. He didn't look down. He looked around. Not with anger, with memory. Because in Harlem, respect wasn't demanded. It was earned. And taking it publicly had consequences. As the patrol car door closed, a man in the crowd said quietly, "They didn't have to do it like this. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And if this is your first time hearing stories like these, the ones never written in police reports, this is the moment to subscribe. Because what follows an arrest like this is never official. It's personal." The sirens faded first. Then the street noise followed. By evening, Harlem felt different. No announcements were made. No orders were given. Yet everyone seemed to know what to do. Card rooms stayed dark. Numbers runners didn't show. Backroom doors that never closed remained locked. Not out of fear of the police, but out of respect for what Bumpy Johnson represented. Inside the precinct, the mood shifted too. Officers spoke lower. Phones rang longer before anyone answered. Because an arrest like that doesn't end a story. It starts one. Men who had once felt protected by badges began watching their mirrors on the way home, sleeping with lights on, double-checking locks. Bumpy hadn't said a word. And that was the warning. When Bumpy Johnson went silent, it meant the count had begun. Somewhere in the city, someone realized too late that public humiliation had a price. And payment was coming. Not loud, not fast, but exact. By the 3rd day, the city started correcting itself. Not through violence, through absence. Certain officers found their usual shortcuts blocked. Familiar faces stopped nodding hello. Neighborhoods they once walked confidently through suddenly felt colder. No threats were spoken. None were needed. Because Harlem ran on memory. And memory was long. Inside his cell, Bumpy Johnson remained calm. He read. He waited. Men came to visit him. Not friends. Messengers. They didn't bring plans. They brought observations. Who was nervous? Who was asking questions? Who was trying to explain themselves? That told Bumpy everything he needed to know. The mistake hadn't been the arrest. Arrests came and went. The mistake was turning it into a show. In Harlem, respect was currency. And someone had just spent it carelessly. Outside, a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be walked back, and everyone involved felt it. By the end of the week, the pressure had settled in. Not on the streets, but in offices. Reports were rewritten. Timelines adjusted, names quietly removed from paperwork. The arrest that was meant to send a message had started sending the wrong one. Inside City Hall, questions were asked in low voices. Not about Bumpy Johnson, but about judgment. Who approved the timing? Who allowed the spectacle? Who thought this would end cleanly? Because Harlem hadn't erupted. It had withdrawn. And withdrawal was dangerous. Inside the jail, Bumpy received his first real update. Not from a lawyer, from a man who didn't need to speak loudly. People are watching, he said. Bumpy nodded once. That was enough. He knew the balance was shifting back. Slowly, inevitably. Public humiliation had a cost. And it was no longer being paid by him. The meeting started without minutes. No notes. No signatures. Just men sitting across from each other, careful with every word. Because now, it wasn't about Bumpy Johnson anymore. It was about control. The arrest had been loud. Too loud. And loud actions attract attention. The kind that doesn't go away. Inside the precinct, careers stalled. Promotions paused. Phones that once rang non-stop suddenly didn't. No one said why. Everyone understood. Outside, Harlem remained calm. Almost polite. That worried them more than chaos ever could. Bumpy's name wasn't spoken publicly. But it didn't need to be. Every decision bent slightly around it. Because power isn't proven by force. It's proven by what happens when you're absent. And even behind bars, Bumpy Johnson was still shaping the room. The release didn't make headlines. That was intentional. No cameras. No statements. Just a door opening and closing quietly. Bumpy Johnson stepped back into Harlem the same way he'd left it. Calm. Measured. Untouched. People noticed without staring. A nod here. A door held open there. Nothing dramatic. Because the lesson had already been learned. The men who had pushed for spectacle found themselves reassigned, moved sideways, left out of conversations that mattered. No revenge, no celebration, just correction. Bumpy walked past the Palm Café without stopping. Some things didn't need revisiting. Harlem exhaled. The balance had returned. Not because force was used, but because respect had been restored. And that was always how Bumpy Johnson preferred it. Years later, people would argue about the details. Dates, names, charges, that was fine. Harlem didn't remember paperwork. It remembered behavior. The day Bumpy Johnson was walked through the streets in cuffs wasn't remembered as a defeat. It was remembered as a lesson. About how power reacts when it's challenged. About how respect reacts when it's tested. Bumpy never spoke publicly about it. He didn't have to. The city adjusted itself after that. Quieter. More careful. Because everyone, on both sides of the line, had learned the same thing. You can arrest a man. You can parade him. But you can't humiliate something. That was built over a lifetime, and in Harlem, that truth outlived everyone involved. By the time the story settled into memory, no one argued about who had won. There was no victory parade, no press conference, no confession, just understanding. The arrest had been loud, The response had been quiet, and the quiet had lasted longer. That was the difference. Bumpy Johnson never needed to remind Harlem who he was. The city already knew. Power that has to announce itself is usually afraid it won't be believed. But real power doesn't shout. It waits. It lets others reveal themselves. Then it restores balance without leaving fingerprints. That's why this story survived. Not because of what was done, but because of what wasn't. And if you've stayed with this story until now, you already understand why Harlem never forgot Bumpy Johnson. Not as a headline, not as a mugshot, but as a presence. A man whose influence could still be felt, even when he said nothing at all. Long after the headlines were recycled, and the files were boxed and shelved, Harlem stayed the same, but smarter. People still talked about Bumpy Johnson, just not loudly. They spoke about him the way you talk about gravity. Not as a threat, as a fact. The Palm Café changed owners. The corner table disappeared. But the rule remained. Don't turn respect into a show. Don't confuse power with spectacle. Because Harlem had seen what happened when someone tried. Bumpy never wrote this story. He lived it. And the city learned something from watching. Noise fades. Authority shifts. But reputation, earned slowly, defended quietly, outlives everyone. That's why, even now, when Harlem remembers Bumpy Johnson, it doesn't remember the arrest. It remembers what followed.